Hey, welcome back to the MobilityWod interview. Very special guest today. We are hanging out with our good friend Steven Kotler, and you may have he's probably been in your consciousness because he's hacked the way that you work, and you've run into his work through one of his books and some of his thinking. What really kind of popped into my consciousness was his amazing work called Rise of the Superman, which we'll talk about, which is all about sort of activating flow state, hyper creative mindsets and sort of consciousness so that we can then impact the aspects of our life. He really makes the case for risk-taking as sort of self-actualization vehicle so that we can impact all the other sort of things that really matter to us as human beings. When I just got his new book, which is about bold, it's really about sort of how the exponential opportunities available to us in the current world, and really builds on top of the works out here. If there's a book that you need to read as an athlete, as a risk taker, of the person who loves flow state, of the runner's high, of the athlete's self, you've got to pick this up first, and I think this will set the groundwork for you really understanding and having a better sort of meta-awareness, metacognition of your own internal processes. This book, of all the things that I've read in the last 5 years, has probably popped up more in conversation, and this has more relevance to my own kind of personal experience and the experience I have with my wife and the work we do than any other thing I've read. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Steven Kotler. Steven, thanks for coming on to the show.
Thanks for having me, Kelly. It's good to be here.
So, look, the background, I mean, I got to tell you that I started kayaking when I was 12, was an extreme whitewater paddler. I have a lot of friends who died kayaking. We were class 5 junkies. I read this book and probably knew 80% of the people that you'd written about, the climbers, the boaters, the skiers. I've run into those people, and reading this was profound because it was like you had literally described my experience in the 20s, and also my sort of struggle out of, hey man, I've had all these really incredible experiences, and I need to be able to parlay them into something that matters in terms of work, because at some point I was not going to keep taking the risks that I was doing. When I quit the national team, was surfing out at Ocean Beach here in San Francisco, which is a big, heavy, inner city, trashy beach break. I literally was out in a big, scary set, and I had a moment of satori and decided I was going to physical therapy school, decided I'd open a gym, and literally, I talk about that moment of satori, and you described it in this book. So can you talk a little bit about what the heart is of, you've coined it flow, and just give us an overview of what that is and how that matters to us.
Sure. So as you pointed out, there are tons of synonyms, right? Flow state, runner's high, being in the zone. If you're a stand-up comic, you call it the forever box. Basketball players like being unconscious. Bebop jazz musicians used to call it in the pocket, right? Flow is a technical term, and we'll talk about why in a second, but it's defined as an optimal state of consciousness, a state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best. And it refers to those moments where we're paying so much attention to the task at hand that we get totally sucked in and everything else vanishes, those moments of absorption. So your sense of self-consciousness, they disappear. Time dilates, which means it passes strangely. Sometimes it speeds up. 5 hours will go by in 5 minutes, and sometimes it slows down. You get that freeze frame effect. Familiar to anybody who's seen The Matrix, bullet time, right? Or been in a car crash. And throughout, all aspects of performance, mental and physical, go through the roof.
What's interesting, man, I just like the associations are pouring in for me, is we believe that sport and training for sport should be about self-actualization. Like, this is why we do it, right? And currently all the work we're doing is saying, hey, look, we've got to take the lessons of the highest levels of sport performance of Formula One, and we've got to take those lessons backwards and be able to translate and transcribe them into our daily lives. Otherwise, sport is just circus, and it's really fun to watch people huck. But we're learning that it's not just about physical self-actualization, that we can and should be learning how to recreate these flow states, because whether into all aspects of my life, because what you have described in this book, what you're just describing, is that some of my most creative, interesting selves and the free associations have happened when I'm in the front of 500 people lecturing, for example. This has been mind-blowing. So I guess, the issue is, as we're talking about this thing that everyone really feels is ubiquitous, what lessons can we learn from what we're practicing into taking those hyper-creative states into our daily lives?
So there's a couple ways to answer this. The first is, if you're getting into flow states frequently through sport, through athletic activity, through public speaking, whatever it is, keep doing more of that, because the brain is plastic. Flow is essentially a focusing skill, right? It's a way of focusing all of our attention into the now, and then all kinds of incredible things start to happen because all kinds of changes in the brain take place when we do that. But
and you're saying that's lasting changes, right? I mean, I want you to get into that, but I mean, it's not just this temporary.
So one of the things we know about flow is it's underpinned by this kind of massive neurochemical dump. And 5 different very potent neurochemicals show up during the state. Quick shorthand for long-term learning is the more neurochemicals that show up during experience, the better chance that experience has of moving from short-term holding into long-term storage. So yes, you get massively heightened peak performance in flow in the moment, but flow also amplifies long-term learning. It amplifies learning. In fact, in studies run by DARPA with military snipers, they found snipers in flow learn 250 to 500% faster than normal, right? Other studies also done by the Defense Department and a company called Advanced Brain Monitoring in Carlsbad, California. They took novice marksmen, so snipers like riflemen, handgun shooters, and archers, and they put them into flow and trained them up to the expert level in 50% less time than it takes to normally train somebody up. So what the research shows is that flow can cut Malcolm Gladwell's fabled 10,000 hours to mastery in half, right? And more than that, the flow you're getting on the ski hill, for example, right, ends up, because you're training your brain to get into that state, so it means that when you go back to work, you're going to have an easier time getting into flow at work. So there really is that kind of one-to-one correlation. So the more flow you have, the more flow you have. And in terms of long-term learning, what you're working on when you're in flow gets seared into the brain. And then, really easy way anybody can have this experience, go through your life. We do this at the Flow Genome Project when we lead workshops all the time, that people think about their life in 5-year chunks and pick their top 3 memories from those 5-year chunks, and you go through your life and you do this, and 80% of those memories are flow states because of its impact on learning and memory.
You just dropped in and tied together. We read Daniel Coyle's book, and he's talking about deep learning, and that these states are deep practice states, really, and then that really allows us to get most of the quality of the time. I mean, that is the talent code. And I think what's interesting for you and me is that that you just also brought up was this neurochemical dump that happens in these places really ends up tying together and freeing up so much of the down regulation of the creative state. I mean, your brain comes together in ways that impacts. I mean, you just sort of intimated the impacts of PTSD, the association between adrenaline sort of searing in those experiences, whether they're good experiences or bad experiences, and hopefully they're good experiences. But this has really implications from treating PTSD to putting myself into good states so I can learn to play the guitar more effectively. I mean, this is amazing.
So you hit on a bunch of things. First of all, I talked to Dan Coyle and I were on the phone not too long ago talking about myelination in flow states, right? And the question is, of course, does flow precipitate more myelination? And we were actually getting set to try to figure this out. There's one researcher, one guy who's really good, and he passed away. So it sort of blocked our research. But we're not done with that idea. the first thing. The second thing you hit on that I think is totally important is, so, McKinsey did a 10-year study of top executives in flow, right? So this is out of the sports context, this is in the business context. And they found that top executives are 5 times more productive in flows. That's 500% more productive. Now, they were measuring output, which is great, but you have to stop and you have to ask yourself, well, what the hell is being amped up so much that's giving you this amazing boost in productivity? One of the things is learning, which we already covered, but you hinted at a second thing, which I think is equally important, which is creativity, innovation, creativity. We're talking about how the ideas start flooding in, all that stuff. So what we now know about creativity is that it's always recombinatory. It's what happens when new information, novel information comes into the brain. We perform pattern recognition, so we link that information to old ideas, and that bursts something startlingly new, right? So if you want to amplify creativity in the brain, you want to surround those processes. So let's go back to those same neurochemicals. 2 of those neurochemicals, norepinephrine and dopamine, are focusing chemicals. When they show up in the brain, we pay more attention to the present. We are literally taking in more information per second, processing it more quickly and processing it more deeply using more brain structures. So we're amplifying the information we're getting. The front end of the creative process is being jacked up. Another thing norepinephrine and dopamine do is they tune signal-to-noise ratios. They amplify pattern recognition. When you have more dopamine in your brain, you notice more connections between ideas. So that second step is being amplified. Then you have anandamide, which is another of the chemicals that shows up. Anandamide boosts lateral thinking. So pattern recognition is the linking together of closely related ideas. Lateral thinking is far-flung ideas. So this neurochemistry literally surrounds the creative process, which is why in studies kind of run all over the world at this point, including stuff done by my organization, the Flow Genome Project, people report it like a 400 to 700% boost in creativity in flow. And even cooler, Teresa Amabile at Harvard figured out that heightened flow state, the heightened creativity in the flow state actually outlasts the flow state, right? Flow state will last usually a couple hours maybe at best, but people report that heightened creativity the day after, sometimes 2 days after flow, which suggests, doesn't prove, but it suggests that flow can actually train the brain to be more creative. Now, this is a big deal. Red Bull Creativity Project, which was the biggest attempt so far to kind of map all the science of creativity, they learned a couple of things. 1, creativity is fundamental to society, really, really important. 2, we have absolutely no idea how to train it up, right? Turns out that flow may solve that second problem.
Do you think, so you, in the Rise of Superman, you use this concept that basically extreme athletes or athletes who are, climbers, boaters, skiers, are putting themselves into states or into positions where they have to trigger flow, otherwise there's dire consequences. That and I can totally relate to this. I remember being really nervous. We didn't like the adrenaline dump feeling, but we're really heightened and nervous, and pushing off from the rock, even though I don't want to go, but then I'm committed, and literally everything would just go. I take 2 breaths, push off from the rock, and now I'm in the middle of the Class 5 rapid, and here we go. And you're saying that was you use as an allegory, because not that we all need to take crazy risks and do backflips off cliffs. We're saying that, boy, this group of people had triggered or figured out how to trigger it every single time because it was life or death. And then that should be sort of allegory for, can we all create our own set of triggers? Am I right?
Well, so so what we now know, is that flow states have about 17 triggers, maybe around 20, but these are things that bring on more flow, right? Action adventure sports as practices are packed with these flow triggers, right? But it's not just these athletes, and I'll give you a classic example. So all of these flow triggers are ways of driving attention into the now. So if you want more flow in your life, pack your life with these flow triggers, right? That's the simple moral of the story. Doesn't matter what the scenario is, but let's take high physical consequences, which is the most obvious with the action adventure sport athletes. And as you pointed out, you're right. For them, it's flow or die in a lot of the situations they're in. But here's where things are totally interesting, because it turns out, while you need to take risk for flow, it doesn't have to be physical risk. You can replace the physical risk with emotional risk, social risk, creative risk. In fact, social risk works so well, and this was your experience in public speaking. the brain cannot actually tell the difference between physical fear and physical risk and social risk and social fear. Same structures, process these things, which sounds crazy until you stop and realize that 150, 200, 300 years ago, if you screwed up socially and got banished or exiled, right, it was capital crime. It was capital punishment. Nobody lived apart from the tribe. So the brain learns to process social risk in the same place it processes physical risk. So that means, you know, you may have to drop into a class 5 river to pull this trigger, but the shy guy just has to raise his hand and speak up at the meeting to pull this trigger. It's entirely relative, and it doesn't have to be physical risk. Now, to kind of jump into the business world a little bit, where I think this becomes really kind of critical is if you're an entrepreneur, if you're working for yourself, if you're running an organization, if you're working in an organization, and you don't have that kind of fail forward, fail frequently, fail often motto, right? That rapid experimentation motto, then you don't have the conditions to take risks. So not only are you losing all the massive benefits of rapid experimentation, which is sort of a different topic that we can get to if you want, but you're denying yourself the easy access to flow and the massively heightened performance that you get as a result.
It's interesting, you know, one of the things that I, as a coach and really looking at, you know, working with some of the best athletes in the world, we look at them under their, you know, we see people perform perfectly in the lab, in the gym, right, in the practice. But we actually go back and look at a lot of tape of the run, the competition, the big, and we see what their default mechanics are. Because I think what's interesting about the work that Coyle does or has talked about is that we say regularly, practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes permanent. And what's interesting, I think, is the conditioned tendency that we expose. We really expose who we are. I mean, the brain connections all happen, but the wiring gets sort of made manifest when we're in these hypercreative states or under big stress positions. And I think, you know, for me, I've been able to take this book and really ask myself, well, what's happening to people in these amazing situations? But I also can use this as a diagnostic tool because, you know, what we're seeing is that, you know, for me, if I want to trigger you into an athletic flow state, for example, in this sort of human performance, then I need to make sure that the practice is there so that when you're falling down the hill, you know, Jeremy Jones on a big steep, you know, the mechanics automatically happen so we can facilitate sort of that physical expression. And it's interesting that, you know, you're in the Flow Dojo of seeing some of the triggers that you guys are using. You're using, because it's the easy one. The physical trigger is the easy one to be a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit, you know, insecure. It's the mental trigger that, you know, to perform or to write. I mean, that's the stuff that, you know, that kills people to try to replicate. So I've seen that this really working towards this flow understanding has, for me, has given me another tool of diagnostics, because I can see who you become in that flow state is really the physical thing.
It definitely gives you a great look at your upper limits, first of all, right? That's one of the things that happens in flow. You know, this is my upper boundary line, so you also know which direction to push on, right? But I think one of the things that's so interesting to me about flow and athletics is people ask me, like, as a skier, for example, my best day on the hill is the day when I don't have flow. What I want is, like, you get in a flow state Monday and you level up and you're doing all these crazy things, and then I got to put in like 3-4 months of like foundational work to get to the point that I can do all the stuff I can do in flow out of flow. And
right.
and usually when those days happen, right, they're totally uncomfortable. I hate those days as an athlete. Really, they're never pleasant because I don't have the, you know, one of the things that happens in flow is all those neurochemicals, they deaden pain. They, you know, things that make the whole experience more fun. But I love the days when they don't show up, and yet I can perform at that level because it tells me that, oh my God, my skills have totally leveled up. And then the next time I get into a flow state, it's going to give me a picture of like the next vista and the next place to go. So I think, you know, you're using it as a diagnostic tool, which is great. I think you get the other side of that where it allows you to kind of look back and look forward at the same time.
If I try to explain some of the phenomena I see in the context of this, one of the things that I think pops up is, you know, I run a CrossFit gym, and we see people in the class setting with a little bit of competition, with a little bit of peer pressure, knowing that they're going to be under physical duress, I think we see some of the magic that you described for average people. They have it in this daily dose, and that's why I think we've seen the Olympic lifting and some basic gymnastics, and plus some of the hard metabolic conditioning has really, I think, focused people in a way and tapped into some deep innate thing that I think you've described perfectly is the reason why people are coming back and becoming really, really hooked on this physical practice, because it is so intellectually difficult at the same time.
Well, one of the things, CrossFit in general, right, if you look at the flow triggers, right, we talked about high risk, high consequences, but you go one step down the line and you talk about a trigger known as rich environment. It's lots of novelty, complexity, unpredictability. All these things grab hold of our attention, they drive it into the now, they trigger dopamine release under the surface, but like the fact that you guys don't post your workouts until the day of, right, I show up and I know CrossFit is going to be hard and I find out just, right, so there's unpredictability, there's complexity, there's novelty, there's consequences, and there's also, if you go into one of the deeper triggers, the challenge skills balance, right? You want whatever you're doing, the task at hand has to be slightly harder than the skills you bring to bear. Yes. And CrossFit is this endless leveling up progression, right? So and of course, it's deeply embodied. You're using multiple sensory streams at once. You're doing a lot of different movements at the same time. So you got to really pay a lot of attention, drives focus on them now. So these are 4 major flow triggers that are all built fundamentally into the CrossFit practice at a really deep level. So of course it's totally addictive, and of course, the flow people are getting to in the gym is translating into their daily life as well.
Amazing. One of the keys that you're saying is that, hey, look, we have a lot of untapped potential in ourselves in terms of solving problems, creativity, collaboration, which is one of the most important. I mean, I read this book. We went to Africa, and then my wife and I got into some conversations about our business that were like, we literally came out and we're like, whoa, what happened? We just time traveled. And we recognized it was, of course, once you sort of gave us that meta framework for understanding so much of our own processes, we saw that, man, we were taking this into the other aspects of our life, and we were getting a lot done very fast. Can you talk about sort of, okay, we've got this, theoretical physical self-actualization, trigger self, but my internal richness goes beyond how many ring dips I can do, or did I snatch 135 pounds or not? You know what I mean? Or did I stick that sick line? I mean, there's a lot more to it, and I think that's
wait. There's more to life than how many ring dips I can do?
Well, I think there are more interesting questions than that, right? And I think that's for me is where I've seen people not be able to sort of connect the dots between why it matters that I am conscious of my process. That because I talk to a lot of really good athletes who have no idea why they're good, but they chew the same gum, they do the same routine, and what they've done is they're like, I have to do the same thing in order to have this outcome, and then they don't also know how to recreate that in the other aspects of their life. I know a lot of Olympic gold medalists who come back from the Olympics and they become depressed, horrible people with no drive, because it's like they haven't figured out how to take all of those things that made them successful and actually reapply them. I mean, I think that's the next step in all this sequence, right?
Yes, and I think so. On a certain level, this is a conversation about passion and purpose. It's sort of now, passion and purpose are phenomenal flow triggers because they focus attention, right? We pay more attention to those things that we believe in, right? Now, we mystify that stuff a lot, and this is, I think, what you see with returning athletes is, first of all, in that competitive environment, they had easy access to flow. So some of it is, there's a downside to flow. It's a big up followed by a big low. If you can't get back into flow all the time, you go through withdrawal. There's a dark side here, right? So that's part of it. The other thing is, I think people who have been incredibly passionate about one thing, I was an Olympic skier, I was whatever, like, they often find it's difficult to find something else they care that much about, and it's because they're misdiagnosing it. When they started out being a skier, they weren't crazy passionate about it. They were curious. Oh, let me try this, let me try this, and one curiosity led to the next, led to the next, led to the next, and over a period of time, by following those curiosities out, right, it led to them to this thing that they're deeply passionate about, and obviously started producing a lot of flow along the way. So I think one of the things we're seeing with the athletes when they come back is they want something that's ready-made in their lives immediately that they can feel as passionate about as they did with their sport, forgetting the fact that they spent 20 years learning to be that passionate about their sport. So that's one of the things. The other thing is I often think that for athletes, and obviously I deal with a lot of extreme athletes who are getting older, having children, having families, and they don't want to risk their life for a living all the time. And the thing, right? The easiest substitution, the one-to-one substitution, is creativity. When we link ideas together, you get a dopamine release, right? Pattern recognition. When we take a physical risk, you get a dopamine release. It's the same chemical. What's so great about action sports is you don't just take one risk, right? As you're going down the ski hill, you're taking dozens and dozens in a row, little tiny risks all the time, right? Creativity is the same way. If I'm improvising a song, I'm making connections over and over and over. If I'm writing, right, new ideas are popping up and I'm following them out, and they're popping up and they're following it. So it's this spiraling, right, that keeps the dopamine, creates a feedback loop of driving attention. It's a nice switch. So what we tell people always is, besides kind of trying to follow their curiosity out, if you're stuck, get a creative hobby. Doesn't matter what it is, right? Start painting watercolors, start gardening. Who cares? What you want is the flow that you're going to get underneath it, because it's going to lead someplace else interesting, just like the flow you got in your early days as an athlete led someplace else that's interesting. You can trust the flow state as, like, it will lead you further, right, into a more interesting life, into something that you're deeply passionate about, that you'll find as fulfilling as you did your athletic career. You just can't be impatient for it, right? You got to realize that career took 20 years to build.
Right. You bring something up. One of the central tenets of CrossFit that people don't understand is early on, the definition of fitness is 100 words or less, which is one of our sort of tenets, is that you need to go learn new sports all the time. Like, you need to learn a new skill. In our own life, my own wife has identified that if I get my like a dog on a bone towards a new hobby, Juliet just supports it. She's like, oh, you need to go learn how to shoot a bow? Go do it. Like, she knows that, because I've identified that these novel triggers really do teach me about myself and about sort of being in that curious state, that creative state. I think that is such a powerful piece of advice. The other thing I think that you bring up is really interesting in the book is that you see that there are definitive down times. There are off seasons. There are big waves and there are no big waves. If we take, on the cover of this book is a kid named, Travis Rice, who is a pretty phenomenal athlete, one of the greatest snowboarders ever or ever will be. Travis, I think, spends the other half of his year on a sailboat in, like, the Bahamas, right? I mean, he is like full flow and then off. Do you feel like sometimes now that we're not seeing those off periods for people? They're not time of reflection and deep creativity. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's a great point, Kelly. So kind of laid out at a big picture, then we'll drill down to your question. We used to think flow was a binary, like a light switch, right? You're either in the zone or you're out of the zone. Now we know it's a 4-stage cycle. Starts with a struggle period. There's a loading phase. Your skill acquisition for an athlete. For a writer, this is when I'm studying my subjects. I'm reading hundreds of books and thousands of papers and diagramming my structures all over my office and blah, blah, blah. So it's a loading phase. Very unpleasant, very uncomfortable, very frustrating, and that's the point. You actually want to take yourself to the brink of madness. Then you want to take your mind off the problem. The second stage is relaxing. So literally do something different. Your conscious mind is really tightly gripped around the problem in the struggle phase. You want to let it relax so the problem can pass from your conscious mind to your subconscious mind. Flow is what happens when the subconscious takes over processing from the conscious mind. Subconscious is far faster, more energy efficient, and has kind of virtually unlimited RAM compared to, like, a very tiny little bit of RAM in your conscious mind. Right? So you want that to happen. You have to. There's this relaxation period that kicks you into the flow state itself. And as you pointed out, on the back end of the flow state, there's a recovery period. It's a big high followed by a deep low. Some of this is the neurochemicals that produce the state are expensive for the brain to produce, right? You need nutrition, you need minerals, vitamins, sunlight, et cetera, et cetera. It's a cocktail. It takes a little while. When you exhaust the supply, the brain has to make more, and it takes a little while. So there is this deep low, and often it's not just
I was going to say, do you think there's a microcycle on that? There's a seasonal cycle, but I also need to, do I need to have a down-regulatory practice every day? I mean, do I, you know what I mean? Because I see this sort of global piece of very, very high, and then I see that people are terrible at turning off and shutting down. It's got.
No, it's not. I mean, Travis gets to take that season off, which is amazing, right? But no, it's it's the small recoveries, and we talk at the Flow Genome Project. It doesn't really matter who we're training, whether it's kind of U.S. Special Forces or big tech companies. Their biggest problem is they never give themselves time for recovery. And a couple things happen that are critical if you don't recover. So first of all, if you start getting stressed out in recovery and you're not like, oh, why am I not back in flow? Why am I not doing more? I have to get going, that kind of stuff. If you start producing cortisol, the stress hormone, little bit is okay. Too much blocks long-term learning. So that long-term amplified learning you get from flow, if you get stressed out in recovery, if you don't recover, you're not going to get it. It'll block, the cortisol will block it, right? The other thing that happens is you move recovery into struggle. Well, if you're anxious in recovery, if you're not recovering, how are you going to get up for the serious fight, struggle to start the whole process over again? And in the real world, forget the sports world, though it's true I think across the boards, but with high performers across the boards, right? They don't like downtime at all. And I think what happened in action and adventure sports, one of the reasons we saw these guys getting so good at it is the sports are weather dependent. Big storm rolls in, everybody goes surfing or skiing or snowboarding. Storm passes, everybody takes a couple days off, right? So these mini recoveries. And another thing that people screw up on is they watch television for in their recovery phase. And television actually, it messes with your brainwaves in such a way that it doesn't allow you to fully, deeply recover. So it's actually a lousy recovery strategy for the brain. And so a lot of things are working against us. But active recovery. With flow, we always say you got to go slow to go fast. It's a massive amplification of performance, but it means respecting the downtime, right? It's you see the same thing in weightlifting. You get like novice weightlifters, and they want to train really hard every day, and their growth is extremely limited, right? Because they're overtraining their muscles by like day 4, and then they're just going to be stuck.
Yeah, huge. I love. That nugget about understanding how television does interrupt this sort of off piece. That is gigantic. We've lost play. And one of the keys of really looking at creating super children, not rise of the super child, is really looking at how do we structure our world into a place where these things happen organically because we're designed to happen that way, and how do we optimize that? Which leads me to another question. We had Chris Davenport on, chatting with him about his kids and skiing, and I have come to believe in the conversation about creating really excellent movers, excellent sort of athletes, this idea of creating a ready state kid. I think you've got to have some kind of action sport in the repertoire. I think you can do it without, but I find that kids who did some kind of sliding sport, some kind of snow skating, hockey works like that, surfing works like that, skateboarding works like that, but there's so much input going on and so much decision making and processing that those kids I've found have become much, much better athletes on the other side.
I think you're right. And I think there's risk taking is so fundamental to anything in life. And if you're not kind of coming up in a sport that forces you to push yourself a little bit farther, a little bit farther, a little bit farther, a little bit farther, you're not training that muscle. And by the time you get into adulthood and say you want to go into entrepreneurship or something like that, you haven't trained up your risk-taking muscles enough along the way. It's going to get very, very difficult for you, right? This is something like the only thing I think today is we're so comfortable that we think fear is a bad thing, when in fact fear is often a compass, right? It points in the direction where we should go. We should go after those things that scare us a little bit. Unless, of course, your thing is wrestling grizzly bears, and then maybe you should hold off. But, I think there's a lot of that. I also think, kids are developmentally flow prone. They have an easier time tuning their brain waves to the right border where flow takes place, and there are neuroanatomical changes that take place in flow that we haven't talked about, but kids are also prone to these experiences. So it is a lot easier to train up kids in flow, and I think you're seeing that, especially in skateboarding right now, but in the other sports as well, where, kids are coming up in these high flow environments, and they're winning X game gold at 12, 13, 14, 15, right? When it took the previous generation didn't get to that level till they were 25, 30, 35, right? So you're getting there so much faster because we have these mental tools now. We're starting, this stuff is brand new, right? The first kind of really hardcore, worthwhile neurobiology, neuroscience on flow didn't start showing up to the late 90s. So, our knowledge of what's actually going on under the hood is 15, 20 years old at best, right? But kids are getting full advantage of it, and I think it's cool.
My wife and I ran a kayaking camp for kids with HIV and AIDS for about 10 years. And we had, basically, it was an embodied leadership school. We'd bring kids in from all over the country, teens who were very critically sick, and we would basically take them kayaking for a week. And boy, talk about novel, scary. Some of our kids couldn't swim. And what we found was that after a week of that exposure, kids were going back and having really amazing blood tests and real transformative experiences in their own lives afterwards, which of course is the model for Outward Bound, but the psychoneuroimmunology of this thing we found to be very, very surprising to us, and very much aligned with what you're just talking about. I mean, our own experiences. Can you, I want to make sure we're talking about bold. Flow state and effective working and risk taking is the heart of sort of the problem solving of the next generation. We're in a profound time where we can really affect some of the problems we're seeing. Can you talk about this next project and how you got here on this book? Because this is an amazing book.
So Bold's co-written with Peter Diamandis, and before Rise of Superman, Peter and I teamed up and wrote a book called Abundance, which was about 4 emerging forces that give mankind the ability to kind of raise global standards of living significantly over the next 10 to 20 years. And when we were done, the general reaction was, oh my God, this is great, abundance is fantastic, now how do I get some? And right? And we were both like, I don't know. We'll think about it. We were writing this big macroscopic, big think book, and it was so far from practical. But what everybody wanted, so we set out to over the past 5 years, we set out to answer the question, like, what does it really take to change the world? And the reason that's so relevant today is for the first time in history, and this is the central theme in Bold, individuals, small teams of people, can now take on the kind of grand global challenges that 10 to 20 years ago were the sole province of large corporations and big governments, right? And we see examples of this all the time. That Peter Diamandis created the X Prize. The greatest example was the X Prize itself. When Peter created this private space prize, first individual who can produce a spaceship that can fly into space twice in 2 weeks, wins $10 million. Everybody said he was crazy. Went to all the aerospace contractors, and they said, you're nuts. It's not possible. Forget about it. Went to NASA, and NASA said, well, you can't do it, and if you can do it, it's going to take 10,000 engineers and cost billions of dollars. And yet 8 years later, Burt Rutan wins the X Prize with a team of like 20 people working out of an oversized garage in the Mojave for about $30 million, right? And that's just one example. But this is all because of exponentially accelerating technology, right? And it's getting easier and easier and easier.
I was just saying, as a touchstone point that everyone can relate to, you look at and use an example of just how hard it is to build a good website. It's went from like $50 million to million to like 5,000 to like boom. That technology alone is exactly what you're talking about.
Well, forget even that technology. Starting a business, right? Entrepreneurship. If you go back, I think it's 10 to 15 years. The number on like what does it cost to start a tech company, right? On average it was $1 million. Today, the average is $5,000, right? You got to think about like YouTube which sold, for I think $1.8 billion when it sold, was a guy in his garage with his credit cards a year and a half earlier, kind of thing, right? So we can take on these giant challenges. But to link it up to today's conversation, if you need to do it, it's not just enough to have exponential technology. This is fantastic, and you have exponential crowd tools, right? Crowdfunding. There's $15 billion worth of capital available to entrepreneurs today. With equity crowdfunding, the numbers are going to go up to $100 billion by 2020. That's more capital than entrepreneurs have ever had access to. With crowdsourcing, right? This is expertise on the demand. So it used to be, if you wanted to found a specific kind of business, you need to put it in a specific area because you needed expertise in that area, right? You don't have to do that anymore. If you can find via crowdsourcing anything you want online. If I want to find an AI expert or a quantum physicist, I can get access to them. So we've broken past this geographical barrier to business. So those things are amazing, but you also have to scale up your mental game, right? And there's two sides to this. You need to be able to think at scale. If you want to have a global impact, right, you need to know how to think at scale. And to kind of get at that, to tease that out, what we do in Bold is we spent a lot of time with Elon Musk, Richard Branson, Jeff Bezos, and Larry Page, because tech entrepreneurs, these guys were extremely wealthy, and until 15 years ago, you needed this much money to think at scale, to play at scale. So we basically spent a lot of time with them and did all this diagnostic work on their speeches, and we distilled their thinking down to 8 core principles that allow anybody to think at scale. But you also have to be able to perform at scale, right? Not thinking is one thing, but you also got to execute. For the execution side, like you have the 8 principles over here. For the execution side, there's flow. That's how you scale up your game, right? If we go back to those earlier numbers, 500% boost in creativity, in learning, in productivity. We talk about flow as the source code of intrinsic motivation, right? Because it's really, once an experience starts producing flow, you go extraordinarily far to get more of it, right? So all these things massively jack up your ability to perform, and you need all this stuff to compete in today's world, and I really mean that, and because the thing is, these techniques are out there, right? Google is applying a lot of the flow stuff that we've been talking about. Facebook is applying a lot of the flow stuff that we're talking about. Amazon, like these companies, these big companies, who are everybody's competition at this point. It doesn't really matter what you're doing. You're sort of competing with Amazon, Google, or Facebook in one way or another. But companies are starting to apply this stuff, right? If your competition has a 500% boost in productivity and you don't, how long are you going to last, right? So if you're not applying these kind of techniques from kind of an evolutionary curve perspective, you're behind the 8 ball.
And I think that's what's, in the community of people who are listening to, I mean, we have a really diverse group of people who primarily also have a physical practice. And what I think is so profound for me is that you're saying, by the way, here is what's happening in all the things that matter to you, the things that you intrinsically are driven to, and understanding, and you've used an allegory and risk taking, and then you basically come over here and say, hey, by the way, you're already setting these things up, you're practicing these things, stitch that same concept in practice because it applies over. And the personal experience is on. It's interesting now. I look back into my 20s, I'm like, why didn't I already have 10 businesses? Why didn't I already, and it seems so obvious now because we have these just ubiquitous tools available to us, and my wife and I are accustomed to taking risks in practice and know how to scale. But I mean, those things just didn't exist. And what I think is really powerful is that you are actually giving us roadmaps to be able to kind of, lead a more, self-actualized life in the work that we're doing. And even on the other side, it's been profound. I mean, I do have one burning question. We're sort of, I don't want to eat up all your time because I'd love to pick your brain even more. But the serious question now: does nutrition affect flow state?
Yeah. So it's a great question, and there's no easy answer, right? First of all, let's be clear. I don't think there's a silver bullet. There's no one magic diet, and both sleep hygiene and nutrition are fundamental. Your body, these are high energy states, right? They burn through a lot of energy, right? Your brain uses 25% of the body's energy at rest. In flow, it's a massive number. If you're not properly fueled, you're screwed. you're not going to have an easy time getting into flow. The other thing is if you're hungry or tired, right, oftentimes, especially when there's risk involved, flow is on the other side of fight or flight, right? So you have to use the kind of focusing chemicals you get from that adrenaline response to follow yourself into flow. If you don't have enough reserves when when that fight or flight response shows up, right, when the risk taking shows up, right, you're not going to be able to switch over and be in the zone. You're going to get caught in fight or flight, and it's going to be a horrible experience, right? So I think nutrition, it's a really foundational, fundamental building block. I don't think there's a magic bullet diet, right? I really don't. And the one thing, that seems to be the case is different people get into flow different ways, right? Some people are susceptible to these triggers, some people are susceptible to these triggers over here. And I think the same thing may be true with nutrition. Like, depending on which way you get in, you may need different nutritional support. I have no idea, but that's just kind of my suspicion. But it's a giant puzzle that we're working on. But there's no one food I can tell you that eat more of this. But I will tell you one thing, just so you know. If you are in flow itself, it doesn't work on the front end, on the loading side, but in flow, dark chocolate, really high quality dark chocolate, seems to extend flow states.
Oh, it's like the ayahuasca of going big. I love it. Do you think, in lieu of this conversation, do you think the Skittle is Marshawn Lynch's mental cue to be able to jump into flow state during football? Do you think?
That's a phenomenally good question, and I don't actually know. Clearly, the guy has an extraordinarily unusual reaction to sugar, because I've never seen a human being carry as many other human beings as that. Like, if he was a fireman, you need one of him, right? You send him into the building, he'd come back with 11 guys and the dog on his back, and done, and just popping Skittles as he goes. I have no idea.
Amazing. Hey,
amazing.
Where can we find? Talk about where we can find you at the Flow Genome. Talk about where we can find your work, and kind of deep dive on the brain of Steven Kotler, which is one of my favorite brains.
Thanks, Kelly. StevenKotler.com. So www.stevenkotler.com. www.riseofsuperman.com will get you Rise of Superman. boldbook.com. And the Flow Genome Project is theflowgenomeproject.com. And for anybody who's curious, on the Flow Genome Project website, we have a free flow diagnostic. So it's kind of like a 16-question overall life survey, and all it will tell you is, hey, this particular direction, this set of activities, you're likely to find a lot of flow in this direction, so go play there. But useful and free.
Amazing. Well, I am dropping out of transient hypofrontality right now as we speak. Thank you so much, dude, for the time, and I look forward to seeing you again, and we will definitely have you back on. Thanks so much, Steven.
Kelly, thanks for having me. I'll talk to you soon.